The Boston rain in November didn't just fall, it felt like it was trying to drill through the asphalt. Fiona Murphy tucked the collar of her worn wool coat higher against her neck, her fingers tightly gripping the handle of a cheap drugstore umbrella that was already buckling under the wind. She was 22 now, her auburn hair pinned up in a messy, practical twist to keep it out of her face, though a few damp tendrils clung to her jawline. It had been a brutal day. Despite her youth, Fiona had earned the role of program manager for Callahan Construction, a chaotic, loud general contractor operating out of a cramped trailer near the seaport. She spent her hours wrangling erratic subcontractors, fighting with city inspectors, managing complex project timelines, and balancing major accounts. But the real weight waited for her at home. Her mother, Maura, was back in the apartment, sleeping off her latest round of chemotherapy. The vibrant, fiercely independent woman who had once cleaned offices all night to keep them afloat was now fragile, her skin translucent, fighting a predatory sickness that consumed every spare dollar Fiona made. Fiona turned down D Street, taking the shortcut toward the bus stop. The streetlights here were spaced too far apart, casting long, fractured shadows across the slick pavement. "Hey, Red." The voice came from the deep shadow of an abandoned brick warehouse. Fiona's stomach instantly tightened. She didn't stop, keeping her eyes locked straight ahead, her pace quickening. "Yo, I'm talking to you." 3 men stepped out of the alley, cutting off her path. They were young, wearing heavy hooded sweatshirts, their hands shoved deep into their pockets. One of them had a jagged scar tracing his jawline. Another was nervously bouncing on the balls of his feet. "Just want to see what's in the bag, sweetheart," the one in the middle said, his voice carrying the distinct, sharp drawl of the city's rougher edges. He stepped closer, blocking the amber glow of the distant streetlight. "Hand it over, and maybe we'll let you keep the umbrella." Fiona stopped. Fear spiked hot in her chest, but the neighborhood she grew up in didn't breed victims. She gripped her purse tightly against her ribs. "Get out of my way," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her breastbone. The nervous one laughed, stepping forward to grab her shoulder. "She thinks she's—" He never finished the sentence. A heavy, dark sedan tore around the corner, its tires screeching against the wet asphalt. The headlights blinded the group, cutting through the rain like twin searchlights. Before the car had even fully ground to a halt, the rear door swung open. A man stepped out into the downpour. He didn't look like the boys from the neighborhood. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray overcoat that fell past his knees, a crisp white collar visible beneath it, completely unbothered by the rain. "You're on the wrong block," the man said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, low resonance that immediately halted the 3 muggers in their tracks. "Who the hell are you?" Scarface barked, though he took a cautious step back. The man didn't answer with words. He stepped into the light, and Fiona caught the flash of a heavy gold ring on his right hand just before it connected with the nervous mugger's jaw. The sound of the impact was sickeningly loud, a dull, heavy crack. The young man dropped straight to the wet concrete like a stone. The remaining 2 froze, their bravado instantly evaporating as they looked past the man to the dark sedan, where the driver's side door had cracked open, revealing the silhouette of another large man waiting. "O'Connor's people?" Scarface whispered, his eyes widening with a sudden panicked recognition. "Shit, we didn't know. "Move," the man in the overcoat said quietly. They didn't need to be told twice. The 2 remaining muggers grabbed their unconscious friend by his jacket sleeves, dragging him backward into the darkness of the alleyway like rats retreating into a hole. Silence descended on the street, save for the rhythmic patter of the rain against Fiona's flimsy umbrella. Fiona stood frozen, her breath coming in ragged plumes of white mist. "Thank you," she managed to exhale, her hands trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. I didn't have much in the bag, but..." The man turned around to face her fully, stepping into the direct beam of his car's headlights. He reached up, carelessly pushing a few strands of wet hair away from his forehead. It was dirty blonde hair. Wavy, thick, and falling in that familiar, effortlessly stylish way that no expensive barber could ever truly replicate or tame. Fiona's voice died in her throat. The streetlights, the rain, the text messages waiting on her phone about her mother's medication. It all blurred into nothingness. Her gaze locked onto his face. The boyish softness was gone, replaced by a sharp, aristocratic jawline, a thin, pale scar slicing through his left eyebrow, and eyes that held the cold, lethal weight of a man who looked at violence every day. But beneath the expensive coat and the hard shell of a syndicate enforcer, the geometry of his face was entirely unchanged. Niall? The name left her lips as a breathless whisper, almost lost to the wind. The man went entirely still. The cold, calculated indifference in his eyes fractured, revealing a sudden, raw vulnerability that looked entirely out of place on a man of his stature. He looked at her auburn hair, heavy with rain, and then down to her pale green eyes. "Fee," he murmured. The world rushed back in a crushing, suffocating wave. Looking at him standing there in the rain, Fiona wasn't 22 anymore. She was 9 years old, sitting on the cold linoleum of apartment 4B, carefully slicing a bologna sandwich in half. The memories didn't just return. They broke over her like a failed levee, dragging her back to the cramped Southie apartment that had been their entire universe. She remembered the exact geometry of her childhood bedroom. It was a tiny space, just big enough for her twin bed and a narrow closet where her winter coats hung. That closet had become Niall's first real sanctuary. Every night, she would leave the closet door cracked exactly 2 inches. There was no hallway light to guide him, just the steady, amber glow of the G Street streetlight cutting through her bedroom window, casting a long, protective spear of light across the floorboards so he wouldn't wake up in total darkness. By the time they turned 11, things had shifted. Maura, who spent her days exhausting herself for a handful of dollars, could no longer ignore the extra pair of worn sneakers by the door or the boy who looked a little less hollowed out by hunger each week. Instead of turning him away, Maura had quietly claimed him. Fiona remembered the Saturday morning her mother came home with a heavy, dated velvet curtain she'd salvaged from an old estate cleanup down in Beacon Hill. Without a word, Maura strung a wire across the corner of the small living room, sectioning off the worn pull-out couch. "A growing boy needs his privacy, Fiona," Maura had said simply, pressing a gentle, rough hand to Niall's cheek. From that night on, he was no longer hiding in a closet. He had a bed, a curtained corner to call his own, and a mother who treated him exactly like her own blood, stretching every pot of potato soup to make sure he got a second helping. And then, she remembered the night the sanctuary shattered. They were 15. His uncle Seamus had tracked Niall down to the sidewalk right outside their building, roaring and vicious, fueled by cheap gin. Niall had intercepted a heavy blow, meant for Fiona, his face a mask of blood as he threw his body weight against the heavy glass doors of the tenement, locking his uncle out and forcing Fiona to run up the stairs. He had looked up at her through the glass, his eyes swelling shut, his mouth bleeding, and whispered a silent go upstairs. By morning, he was gone. The neighborhood had buzzed with rumors, but inside apartment 4B, there was only a devastating, hollow silence. Fiona and Maura hadn't just wondered where he was. They had truly mourned him. They had wept for the boy who left all his belongings behind that velvet curtain, as meager as they were. For 7 years, Fiona had carried a quiet, aching grief, looking for that careless, wavy blonde hair in every Boston crowd, praying he wasn't buried in an unmarked grave somewhere beyond the bridge. "It's really you," Fiona breathed, taking a tentative step forward, her umbrella completely forgotten as it tilted backward, letting the rain drench her face. Niall closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't care about the rain ruining his custom suit. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering just an inch above her shoulder, as if he was terrified that touching her might make the apparition vanish. "You're freezing, Fee," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he clearly wasn't used to managing. He looked down at her practical boots, her damp coat, and the exhaustion etched deep around her green eyes. He knew about her mother. In the underworld, information was currency, and Niall had quietly kept a distant, protective eye on apartment 4B for years, even when he couldn't step back into her life. "Where have you been, Niall?" she asked, her voice trembling, a tear mixing with the rainwater tracking down her cheek. 7 years? Ma and I, we thought you were dead. We looked everywhere for you." Neil looked back at the dark sedan, where his driver was waiting patiently, then looked back at the girl who had kept him alive when he was a starving child with nowhere safe to go. "Learning how to make sure nobody could ever hurt us again," Niall said quietly. He took the handle of her cheap umbrella from her shaking fingers, his warmth transferring to her skin. "Come on, I'm taking you home." The door of the sedan shut, with a heavy pressurized thud, instantly swallowing the roar of the Boston rain. The interior was a world of absolute, unbothered luxury, all masculine soft leather, soft blue dashboard lights, and the faint, clean scent of cedar. But the warmth did nothing to thaw the sudden, ice-cold fury radiating from Fiona. She sat rigidly, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists in her lap. Her damp wool coat clung to her shoulders, dripping onto the pristine floor mat. She didn't look at the high-tech console or the smooth movements of the driver, Tommy, as he navigated the car away from the curb. She kept her eyes locked straight ahead, her jaw set so tightly it ached. Niall reached forward, adjusting a dial on the dash to push more heat toward her side of the car. "Fee, you're shivering. Let the air—" "Don't!" she snapped sharply. The word cut through the quiet cabin like a jagged piece of slate. Tommy's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror for a fraction of a second before he deliberately focused back on the slick pavement of D Street. Niall let his hand fall back to his knee. The cool, untouchable demeanor he carried on the docks, the mask of the old man's ruthless right hand, cracked entirely. "Fee, please, just talk to me." "Talk to you?" Fiona turned her head slowly, her light green eyes flashing with a raw, bleeding hurt that made Niall visibly flinch. "You want to talk now? After 7 years of absolute silence?" "I couldn't—" "Do not tell me what you couldn't do, Niall Sullivan." Her voice cracked, the anger finally splitting open to reveal the deep, hollow ache she had carried since she was 15. "We mourned you. Do you have any idea what that means? We didn't just wonder if you ran away. We thought you were dead. We thought your uncle finally dragged you down to the rail yards or the water and finished what he started." Every night, the car glided smoothly past a row of old brick triple-deckers, the amber streetlights casting fast, rhythmic shadows across Fiona's pale face. "Ma sat at that kitchen table for 6 months with the police reports," Fiona whispered, her breath trembling as a hot tear finally spilled over, cutting a clean path through the rainwater on her cheek. She blamed herself. She thought if she hadn't hung that velvet curtain, if she'd just fought harder to adopt you legally, if we hadn't been so damn poor, you wouldn't have been out on that sidewalk that night. She cried herself to sleep until her eyes turned red. "Neil, my ma. The woman who treated you like her own son when your own blood was treating you like a punching bag." Niall closed his eyes, his aristocratic jaw tightening until a muscle leaped in his cheek. The scar through his left eyebrow looked stark and white against his skin in the dim light. "I know," he said, his voice dropping into a rough, strained register. "God, Fee, I know. You think I wanted to leave? O'Connor didn't give me a choice. When he pulled me out of that alley, I was bleeding out. He put his own doctors on me. But he told me if I ever went back to G Street, if I brought that kind of heat around his operations before I was ready, he'd let Seamus have me back. Or worse. So you just forgot us?" "I never forgot you," Niall roared, his sudden intensity causing Tommy to subtly adjust his grip on the steering wheel. Niall leaned in, his pale eyes burning with a desperate, feral sincerity. "Every single day. Every time I had to do something terrible to survive in O'Connor's world, I thought about that bedroom window. I thought about the streetlight coming through the crack in the closet. I thought about the soup your ma used to stretch just so I could have a full stomach. You two were the only clean things I had left in my head." He reached out, his large, calloused hand grasping her forearm. He didn't pull her close. He just held on like a drowning man catching a line. I couldn't come back as a half-broke street kid, Fee. If I did, I couldn't protect you. I had to become something. I had to earn the old man's name, earn the keys to the unions, earn the weight it takes to move people off these blocks. I didn't stay away because I didn't care. I stayed away because I was building a wall around this neighborhood so nobody could ever touch you again. Fiona looked down at his hand on her arm. The expensive charcoal sleeve of his overcoat brushed against her cheap, fraying jacket. The boy who used to share her fractions worksheets was gone, replaced by a man who commanded the shadows of Boston. But the grip on her arm was exactly the same, fierce, unyielding, and terrified of being left behind. You built a wall, Niall, Fiona said softly, her voice heavy with the exhaustion of a girl who had spent the last 2 years watching her mother fade away. But you built it on top of our grief. You let us think you were dead. She pulled her arm back, breaking his grip. She didn't look at him again as the sedan turned onto G Street, slowing down as it approached the familiar, weathered stoop of their childhood building. The stairs of the tenement building hadn't changed at all. They still smelled of boiled cabbage, old floor wax, and the damp chill of a New England winter filtering through drafty window panes. Niall walked half a step behind Fiona, his heavy, expensive leather shoes silent on the worn wooden steps compared to the practical, tired thud of her work boots. He had left Tommy with the car in the alley, stepping back into the past with nothing but the umbrella in his hand and a heavy, suffocating anxiety in his chest. As they reached the third-floor landing, a door across the hall clicked open. A tiny, silver-haired woman poked her head out, her eyes squinting through thick, round spectacles. Mrs. Higgins. She wore the same faded plaid housecoat she'd had 10 years ago, though her shoulders were sharper now, her frame slighter. "Fiona, love?" the old woman called out, her voice a thin, reedy bird chirp. "Is that you? I kept my eyes on the stairs, I did. But I thought my nephew from Galway was coming up. Did he bring the potatoes?" Fiona stopped, her tense posture softening instantly with a practiced, gentle patience. "No, Mrs. Higgins. It's just me. I'm coming home from work." Mrs. Higgins's eyes wandered past Fiona, settling on the tall, broad-shadowed man standing in the shadows of the landing. She blinked, her forgetful mind straining against the fog of time. She looked at the wavy, dirty blonde hair, the sharp jaw, and the way he instinctively hunched his shoulders back slightly when she looked at him. "Niall?" she whispered, a sudden, surprising clarity lighting up her old eyes. "Niall Sullivan? You've come home from the store, then? Your uncle was shouting earlier. Or was that yesterday?" Niall felt a sharp ache in his throat. He took a step forward, pulling a crisp $100 bill from his pocket and gently slipping it into the pocket of her housecoat. "It's me, Mrs. Higgins. I'm back. Go inside where it's warm, okay? Don't worry about Seamus anymore. He's gone." "Oh, good boy. Always a good boy," she mumbled, already losing the thread of the conversation as she patted her pocket, turning back into her apartment and shutting the door with a soft click. Fiona watched the exchange, her expression guarded. She turned around, unlocked the door to apartment 4B, and stepped inside. The radiator was clanking. Thump hiss, thump hiss. The apartment was small, immaculate, and heartbreakingly familiar. The old velvet curtain Maura had salvaged from the Beacon Hill estate was gone, but the small living room still held the same worn pull-out couch. On the small Formica kitchen table sat a neat stack of medical bills and 3 different prescription bottles. "Ma!" Fiona called out softly, shedding her wet coat. A faint, raspy voice drifted from the bedroom down the short hall. "Fiona? You're late, bug. The rain bad?" Niall stood frozen in the doorway, his large frame making the small entryway look microscopic. He took off his charcoal overcoat, holding it carefully, suddenly terrified that his presence might break the fragile peace of the room. "The rain's bad, Ma," Fiona said, walking down the hall. "But we have company. Someone's here to see you." Niall followed her down the narrow hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs harder than it ever had during a sit-down with the rival syndicates. He stepped into the doorway of the small bedroom. Maura Murphy lay in the twin bed under a heavy patchwork quilt. Her dark hair was mostly gone, replaced by a soft woolen cap, and her face was lined with the deep, hollow exhaustion of the chemotherapy. But when her pale green eyes flicked up and landed on the man standing in her doorway, the gray weariness vanished. She stared at the dirty blonde hair. She stared at the pale scar on his eyebrow. Maura didn't scream or cry. She simply reached out a thin, trembling hand, her fingers curling into the air, reaching across 7 years of silence. "You're alive." Niall dropped to his knees beside the bed, entirely unheeding of his custom trousers hitting the old floorboards. He took her small, frail hand in both of his large, calloused ones, pressing her knuckles against his forehead as the first tear of his adult life finally broke. "I'm alive, Ma," he choked out. "I'm home." The small bedroom was warm, smelling faintly of peppermint tea, rubbing alcohol, and the crisp ozone scent of the rain drifting off Niall's clothes. Niall stayed on his knees by the mattress, his head bowed against Maura's frail hand. To anyone on the Boston docks, he was the old man's shadow, a man whose name was whispered with caution in union halls and dark alleys. But here, with his forehead pressed against the worn patchwork quilt, he looked entirely hollowed out, stripped down to the 15-year-old boy who had vanished into the dark. Maura's thin fingers tangled weakly in his wavy blonde hair, her thumb tracing the edge of his jaw. A bright, watery smile split her pale face, color returning to her cheeks for the first time in weeks. "Look at you," Maura whispered, her voice raspy but floating with a fierce maternal joy. "Look at those broad shoulders. They fed you well, didn't they, Niall? You're a proper man." "They fed me, Ma," Niall managed to say, lifting his head. His pale eyes were rimmed with red, a rare, raw vulnerability exposed on his face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry it took me 7 years to get back across the bridge." "You're here now," she chided gently, her grip tightening on his hand with surprising strength. "That's what matters. You're breathing and you're whole. My prayers weren't wasted on the wind." From the doorway, Fiona stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, leaning her shoulder against the doorframe. Her face was a mask of perfect, calculated calm. She watched her mother's chest rise and fall with a lightness that had been entirely absent since the diagnosis, and she made a silent, ironclad vow. She would not steal this joy from her. Maura didn't have the strength to carry Fiona's anger. She didn't have the time. If her mother wanted to believe the lost boy had returned as an angel, Fiona would let her believe it. She would swallow the anger of her own betrayal, keeping her fury locked safely behind her teeth until she and Niall were out of her mother's sight. "Fee-bug, look at him," Maura called out, turning her head slightly on the pillow, her eyes shining. "Didn't I tell you? Didn't I say our Niall was too smart for this city to destroy?" Fiona let her arms fall to her sides, forcing a soft, brilliant smile to her lips. She stepped into the room, her voice smooth and warm, entirely detached from the storm raging in her chest. "You did, Ma. You always said he'd find his way." She walked over to the nightstand, deliberately avoiding Niall's gaze as he shifted his large frame to give her space. She picked up the empty plastic teacup, her fingers steady. "I'm going to put a fresh kettle on, Ma. You need to take your 9 o'clock pills soon anyway." "Bring an extra mug, Fiona," Maura said, her eyes already tracking back to Niall, drinking in his face as if trying to memorize the 7 years she'd missed. "Niall's staying for tea. He's going to tell me everything." "Of course he is," Fiona said softly. She turned and walked down the short hallway, her smile vanishing the absolute second her back was to the bedroom. By the time she reached the small kitchen, her jaw was aching from the tension. She set the kettle under the tap, the sharp roar of the water filling the silence of the room. She stared at the old Formica counter, her hands gripping the edge until her knuckles turned white. The radiator clanked, thump hiss, a mocking reminder that while Niall had been living in luxury, building his walls and earning his reputation, she and her mother had been right here, enduring the cold, counting pennies, and mourning a boy who was busy becoming a prince. A soft, hesitant step echoed on the linoleum behind her. Fiona didn't turn around. She shut off the tap, set the heavy kettle on the stovetop, and clicked the burner to life. The blue flame flared up, casting sharp, dancing shadows against the kitchen wall. "Fee," Niall said quietly from the edge of the kitchen. He had left his jacket in the hallway, and in his crisp white shirt, he looked massive against the small dimensions of their kitchen. "Thank you. For not outing me to her." Fiona turned around slowly. The soft, gentle daughter from the bedroom was entirely gone. Her light green eyes were cold, sharp, and lethal enough to rival any look Niall had ever given a man on the docks. "Do not mistake my kindness to my mother for forgiveness to you, Niall Sullivan," she whispered, her voice dropping into a low, vicious register that barely carried over the hiss of the stove. "She is happy because she thinks the boy she loved came home. But I know what you actually are. You're O'Connor's shadow. You chose a crime boss over the family that starved to keep you alive." Niall took a step forward, his hands lifting in a rare gesture of total surrender. "I didn't choose him over you, Fee. I used him to get the power I needed to protect you. If you knew the things I had to do." "I don't care about your excuses, and I don't care about your syndicate," Fiona snapped, stepping closer until she was inches from his chest, her head tilted up to lock eyes with him. "You let us weep for you. You broke our hearts. For 7 years. You sit there and drink her tea, and you play the good son tonight because it makes her happy. But tomorrow, you stay away from my building. We don't need your blood money, and we don't need your protection." The kettle began to give a low, rising whistle, cutting between them like a siren. Niall didn't back down, his pale eyes burning with that same unbreakable, stubborn grit he'd had at 9 years old. "I'm not leaving, Fee," he said softly, his voice steady and unyielding. "You can hate me all you want. You can scream at me until the doomsday. But I'm not letting you carry this weight alone anymore." The rain finally stopped around midnight, leaving South Boston draped in a heavy, freezing mist that smelled of salt water and wet soot. Inside apartment 4B, Maura had finally drifted off to sleep, her breathing deep and even under the heavy blue quilt. Niall had stayed by her side until her fingers uncurled from his, then he had quietly retreated to the hallway, slipping his charcoal overcoat back over his shoulders. Fiona stood by the small kitchen counter, her arms crossed, watching him with the same cold, unyielding green eyes. She hadn't said a single word to him since their confrontation by the stove. "She's asleep," Niall said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper. He paused by the door, his hand resting on the heavy deadbolt. He looked at her, desperately searching for a crack in her armor, a hint of the girl who used to leave the closet door open 2 inches. "I'll be back tomorrow. Fee, to check on her." "Don't," Fiona said, her voice a flat, dead calm. "I told you, Niall. You gave her a good night, and I thank you for that. But we don't belong in your world, and you don't belong in ours anymore. Leave us be." Niall's jaw tightened, the muscle leaping under his sharp skin. He wanted to argue, to shake her, to tell her that he had spent 7 years bleeding just to have the right to stand on this side of the bridge. But he knew her stubbornness. It was the exact same brand as his own. "Good night, Fiona," he murmured, stepping out onto the creaking wooden landing and closing the door softly behind him. He walked down the dark, drafty stairwell, his heavy leather, shoes making no sound against the worn steps. The air grew colder the lower he descended, the damp chill of the harbor filtering through the tenement's loose window panes. When he pushed open the heavy glass doors of the building's entrance, he didn't head straight for the alley where Tommy was waiting with the sedan. Instead, he stepped onto the wet concrete of G Street, pulling a silver lighter from his pocket, and sparked a cigarette. He took a long, slow drag, his pale eyes scanning the familiar blocks of his childhood. The street was dead quiet, the amber streetlights haloed by the thick November fog. But Niall hadn't survived 7 years in Liam O'Connor's syndicate by being unobservant. A block away, idling beneath a flickering light near the old corner grocery, sat a battered dark blue sedan. The engine was running, a thin plume of white exhaust rising into the freezing air. Inside, the glowing embers of 2 cigarettes illuminated the rough silhouettes of 2 men. Niall didn't move. He kept his back against the brick wall of Fiona's building, his eyes tracking the car. A minute later, a young man in a heavy, oversized sports jacket stepped out of the alleyway across the street. He didn't look like a Southie kid. He walked with a nervous, twitchy stride, checking the numbers on the buildings before glancing back at the idling sedan. Scouts. Niall's blood went instantly cold, replaced by a dark, lethal focus. These weren't O'Connor's men, and they weren't local street thugs like the ones he'd broken up on D Street earlier. The twitchy stride, the specific model of the car, it belonged to the Franchetti crew, a ruthless Italian faction from the north, and that had been aggressively probing O'Connor's southern borders for months. They didn't know Niall was connected to this specific building. They were scouting the entire block, mapping out the territory for a drug route expansion that would bring vice, violence, and predictable turf wars right to Fiona's front door. Niall dropped the cigarette, crushing it beneath the heel of his shoe. He didn't confront them. Not here. Not on the street where Fiona could look out her window and see the flash of muzzle fire. He walked briskly down the alleyway, slipping, into the backseat of his own sedan. Tommy didn't say a word, his hands tightening on the wheel as he saw the expression on Niall's face in the rearview mirror. "We have a problem on G Street," Niall said, his voice flat, completely devoid of the warmth he had used with Maura. "Franchetti's. People are scouting the block. They're looking to push a line through these tenements." Tommy's eyes widened slightly. "Do we call the old man? Get a sit-down?" "No," Niall snapped, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, protective ferocity. "This is my home. If the North End brings their poison to these blocks, they burn. I want 2 of our best men on this corner 24 hours a day. Put them in an unmarked car. If anyone so much as looks at Building 44 with an attitude, I want to know about it before they take their next breath." "But Tommy?" "Yeah, boss. They stay out of sight, especially from the girl with the red hair." 3 days later, the fog had cleared, leaving Boston gripped in a bitter, brilliant autumn chill. Fiona hurried down the steps of her building at 6 in the morning, her breath blooming in thick white clouds. She was exhausted. Her mother had suffered a severe bout of nausea the night before, keeping Fiona up until 3 a.m., wiping her brow and administering anti-nausea medication. Now, Fiona had a high-stakes project deadline at Callahan Construction, a massive concrete pour-down at the seaport that required her absolute focus. She turned the corner of G Street, her work bag slung heavily over her shoulder, and froze. Parked. Directly across from her building was a brand-new, immaculate black SUV with heavily tinted windows. The vehicle stood out like a sore thumb against the dented station wagons and rusted pickup trucks of the working-class neighborhood. As she watched, the driver's side window rolled down exactly 2 inches. Inside, she caught the distinct glimpse of a large man wearing a dark professional suit and a wireless earpiece. His eyes scanned the street with a practiced military precision, lingering on her for a fraction of a second before darting back to the corner alley. Fiona's stomach dropped, a hot spike of anger flaring through her fatigue. She didn't walk to the bus stop. Instead, she marched directly across the street, her work boots clicking sharply against the asphalt, and slammed her hand against the SUV's dark glass. The window rolled down fully, revealing a massive, broad-shouldered man with a broken nose and a sharp haircut. He looked at her with a completely blank, unbothered expression. "Can I help you, miss?" "You can get the hell off my block," Fiona hissed, her green eyes blazing. "I know who you work for. Tell Niall Sullivan that if he doesn't pull his secret service agents away from my mother's house by the time I get home from work, I'm calling the Boston police." The man didn't flinch. He didn't even look angry. He simply reached for a phone on his dashboard. "I'll pass the message along, Miss Murphy. Have a safe day at work." Fiona spun on her heel, her blood boiling as she stormed toward the bus station. She managed to survive her day at Callahan Construction through sheer caffeinated willpower, managing the chaotic concrete trucks and arguing with city inspectors, but the thought of the dark SUV parked outside her home haunted her every hour. By 5 p.m., she was back in Southie. As the bus ground to a halt on Broadway, she didn't head home. She walked straight toward a quiet, historic Irish pub near the lower end of the neighborhood, a place called the Shamrock Pub. It was a known spot where O'Connor's people handled their local business, a neutral ground where the neighborhood's old guard met the new. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the scent of stale beer, wood smoke, and fried potatoes hitting her face. The pub was dim, populated by a few older dock workers at the bar. But in the far corner, sitting in a leather booth beneath a vintage Guinness mirror, sat Niall. He was wearing a tailored navy suit, a glass of amber whiskey sitting untouched on the table in front of him. He was reviewing a stack of construction, permits and union ledgers, but the moment the pub door opened, his head snapped up. When he saw Fiona walking toward him, her auburn hair windblown and her jaw set in that familiar lethal line, he quietly stacked his papers and slid them into a leather briefcase. "Fiona," he said, rising to his feet as she reached the booth. "Get your men out of Southie, Niall," she said, her voice low but carrying a vibrating intensity that made the bartender look over for a split second before wisely turning back to his taps. "I am not going to live my life with Mafia thugs watching. My mother go to her doctor appointments. We are not your property." Neil didn't fire back with anger. He looked at her, his pale eyes completely serious, and gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Sit down, Fee, please." "I am not sitting down with—" "Fiona, sit down," he repeated, his voice dropping into a commanding, heavy register that finally made her pause. "Please. It's about the neighborhood. It's about Maura." The mention of her mother's name cut through her fury like a knife. Fiona hesitated, then slid into the leather booth, her posture rigid, her bag held like a shield against her chest. "If you're using her to manipulate me, Niall—" "I'm not," Niall interrupted, leaning across the table, his face just inches from hers. The dim lighting of the pub caught the thin scar on his eyebrow. "3 nights ago, when I left your building, I caught 2 scouts from the Franchetti crew patrolling G Street. The North End is trying to push a major distribution line through our tenements. They don't know who I am to that building, but they are looking to turn your block into a war zone." Fiona went entirely still, the anger dying in her throat as a cold, instinctual dread took its place. She had grown up in Southie. She knew what turf wars looked like. She remembered the early 90s, the broken glass, the sirens, the innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire of rival crews. "They're scouting the buildings," Niall continued, his voice raw with a fierce, protective desperation. "They look for vulnerable places. Apartments with old women like Mrs. Higgins, OG homes where people are too sick or too tired to fight back, so they can use the basements or the alleyways to store their product. If I pull my men off that corner, Fiona, I am leaving you and Ma completely defenseless against people who do not care about the rules of this neighborhood." He reached across the table, his large, calloused hand flat on the wood, hesitating before he gently covered her trembling fingers. "You can hate me for the last 7 years, Niall whispered, his pale eyes locking onto hers with an unbreakable, soul-deep intensity. "You can curse my name every single day, but I swore an oath to myself the night I left that I would never let anyone make you afraid in your own home again. My men stay, not to watch you, to make sure the monsters stay on their side of the bridge." Fiona looked down at his hand on her arm. The expensive charcoal sleeve of his overcoat brushed against her cheap fraying jacket. The boy who used to share her fractions worksheets was gone, replaced by a man who commanded the shadows of Boston. The truce shattered exactly 2 weeks later, on a night when the moon was nothing but a silver sliver hidden behind low, bruised clouds. It was nearly 11 p.m. Maura had been sleeping peacefully for hours, comforted by the steady warmth of the space heaters. Fiona sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open as she reviewed the concrete submittals for Callahan Construction's project. Phase. The apartment was completely quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Then, a sound cut through the silence. It wasn't the radiator. It was a sharp metallic pop from the alleyway directly beneath her bedroom window, followed by the muffled, heavy thud of a body hitting the brick wall. Fiona's instincts, honed by a childhood in a neighborhood that required constant vigilance, kicked in instantly. She stood up, extinguishing the kitchen light, and slipped into her dark bedroom. She crawled toward the window, keeping her head low, and parted the old blinds by a fraction of an inch. The alleyway below was illuminated only by the distant, amber glow of the G Street streetlight. Through the gloom, she saw the silhouette of the dark SUV Niall had stationed down the block. But it wasn't idling peacefully. The driver's side door was open, and the massive enforcer with the broken nose, the one she had yelled at weeks ago, was slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. 3 men in heavy dark parkas were moving with terrifying speed toward the back entrance of her tenement building. One of them held a short, heavy crowbar. Another had his hand shoved deep into his pocket, the distinct hard shape of a silenced pistol visible through the fabric. Franchetti's crew. They were making their move. Panic seized her throat, hot and suffocating. They weren't just scouting anymore. They were coming inside to clear out the building's basement for their operations, and anyone who saw them would be collateral damage. Her mother was sleeping just 30 feet away, entirely defenseless. Fiona scrambled backward across the floorboards, her heart hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped her phone as she scrambled through her contacts. She didn't call the police in these blocks. By the time a cruiser arrived, the alley would already be cleaned, and the retribution would be permanent. She dialed the only number that mattered. It rang once. "Fee?" Niall's voice came through the speaker, instantly alert, sharp, and entirely devoid of sleep. He had been awake, waiting, as if he knew this phone call would eventually come. "Niall," she whispered, her voice cracking as she huddled against the wall beneath her window. "They're in the alley. The man in your car, he's not moving. 3 of them are at the back door with a crowbar. Niall, they're coming inside." The silence on the other end of the line lasted for less than a second, but when Niall spoke again, his voice had transformed into something sub-zero, a terrifying instrument of absolute command. "Lock your deadbolt, Fiona. Drag the heavy oak dresser in front of the bedroom door. Take Ma, get into the bathroom and lock that door too. Do it right now." "Niall, where are you?" "I'm already on Broadway," he barked, the roar of a powerful engine suddenly revving in the background of the call. "I'm 2 minutes out. Do not open that door for anyone but me. Do you hear me, Fee? Nobody." The line went dead. Fiona dropped the phone and moved with a fierce, adrenaline-fueled strength. She ran to the front door, throwing the heavy deadbolt and twisting the security chain into place. Then she bolted back into her mother's room. Maura shifted weakly, murmuring in her sleep as Fiona grabbed the edges of the heavy oak dresser and hauled it across the hardwood floorboards, jamming it securely against the bedroom doorframe. From the stairwell outside, a sharp, splintering crack echoed through the building's lower levels. The back door had given way. Fiona hurried to her mother's bedside, her hands trembling as she gently shook Maura's shoulder. Ma, wake up. We need to go into the bathroom for a minute, okay? Just a precaution." Maura blinked open her pale green eyes, confused and disoriented by the darkness. "Fiona, what's that noise, bug?" Heavy, hurried footsteps were already ascending the wooden stairs. They were passing the 2nd floor, then the 3rd. Fiona hauled her mother out of bed, supporting most of Maura's frail weight as they stumbled, into the small windowless bathroom at the end of the hall. She shut the heavy wooden door and threw the brass latch, pulling her mother down onto the bath mat and wrapping her arms around her. Outside the apartment, the footsteps stopped. A heavy boot slammed against the front door of apartment 4B. The yessi. Wood groaned, the frame splintering as the deadbolt fought against the pressure. "Hey, check the locks on this one!" A rough, unfamiliar voice shouted from the hallway. "The old lady across the hall said someone lives here." "Just kick it in, let's get the crates up the basement stairs first." A second kick rattled the apartment, the security chain screaming against the wood screws. Fiona squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her forehead against her mother's woolen cap. praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. Then, the hallway exploded into absolute chaos. The heavy metallic roar of a vehicle's tires screeching down G Street echoed through the drafty windows, followed by the unmistakable, violent crash of a car ramming into the front stoop. Shouts erupted in the hallway. "What the hell is—" A deafening, rapid succession of gunshots shattered the night sharp, rhythmic, and terrifyingly close. The sounds were muffled by the heavy apartment door, but the violence of the impact was unmistakable. Screams of panic cut through the air, followed by the heavy, consecutive thuds of bodies collapsing against the hallway floorboards. Silence fell over the fourth floor, thick and suffocating. Fiona held her breath. Her heart stopped, her ears straining against the quiet. Minutes stretched like hours. Maura was trembling in her arms, whispering a silent Hail Mary into the dark. Then, a heavy, familiar hand knocked on the splintered wood of the front door. Not a violent kick, a specific rhythmic pattern. 3 slow raps, then 2 fast ones. The exact same knock he used to use at 9 years old when his uncle was throwing chairs. "Fee," Niall's voice called out through the broken frame, tight, breathless, and laced with a terrifying anxiety. "Fee, it's me. It's safe. Open the door." Fiona didn't remember moving the heavy oak dresser away from the door. She didn't remember unlocking the brass latch on the bathroom door or stepping over the splintered remains of her apartment's entryway. Her body moved entirely on a wave of pure, unadulterated survival instinct. When she finally pulled the front door open, the hallway smelled sharply of sulfur, copper, and the cold, biting winter air pouring in from the shattered lower windows. Niall stood in the threshold. His navy suit jacket was gone, his white shirt, stained with a slash of dark grease across the ribs, and his hair was wildly disheveled, falling in damp, chaotic waves across his forehead. In his right hand, he held a heavy black pistol, the barrel still warm, though he lowered it the absolute second his pale eyes landed on her. "Fee," he choked out. He didn't wait for her permission. He dropped the weapon onto the floorboards and closed the distance between them in a single, desperate stride, his large hands reaching out to anchor her by the waist. When his lips met hers, it wasn't a gentle, hesitant question. It was the violent, beautiful collision of 7 years of unspent grief, buried devotion, and a love that had refused to die in the dark. It was the taste of the rain on D Street, the amber light through the closet door, the blue velvet curtain, and every single night they had spent breathing the same air in apartment 4B. Fiona's hands tangled fiercely into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, her tears hot against his cheek as the last remnants of her anger collapsed into the absolute certainty of his embrace. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers, his breath hitching in his chest. His hands were trembling as they cradled her face. "Pack a bag," he said, his voice a low, raw command that brooked absolutely no argument. "Right now, Fee, you and Ma, you're leaving this building tonight." Fiona blinked, the spell breaking slightly as her practical mind tried to reassert itself. She looked past his shoulder at the dark hallway, where Tommy, bleeding from a nasty gash on his temple but very much alive, was already organizing 3 other suited men to clear the landing. "Niall, wait," Fiona whispered, her hands still resting on his chest. "We can't just leave. My job at Callahan, Ma's appointments at the clinic, all our things." "I don't care about the things, and I'll buy Callahan Construction by morning if it means you don't have to walk back down D Street," Niall interrupted, his eyes burning with a terrifying, unyielding intensity. He gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look straight into his pale eyes. "The Franchetti crew failed tonight. That means they're going to come back twice as hard, and they're going to look for any lever they can find to pull me down. This block is a war zone now, Fiona. I am not leaving my heart in a target. You are coming to my penthouse. Tonight." "Niall, my mother cannot handle a chaotic move," Fiona argued, her stubborn Irish pride flaring up one last time despite the fear pulsing in her veins. "She needs stability. She needs a building with a private elevator, 24-hour medical services, and a filtration system that doesn't smell like wet soot." Niall said, his voice entirely firm, shifting into the absolute authority of a man who commanded the city's shadows. He leaned in, his lips brushing her temple. I'm not asking, Fee. For 7 years I let you think I was dead because I thought it kept you safe. I was wrong. I'm taking care of you now, both of you. Tommy will have a crew here tomorrow morning to pack every single stitch of clothing and every memory in this apartment. But tonight, you only take what Ma needs to sleep. Fiona looked at him for a long, heavy moment. She saw the ironclad resolve in his jaw, the fiercely protective tilt of his shoulders, and she realized the fight was over. She didn't want to fight him anymore. She was so tired of carrying the weight alone. Okay, she whispered. Okay. As she turned back into the apartment to gently rouse her mother and pack a small duffel bag with Mora's medications, she heard Niall step back out onto the creaking wooden landing. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his voice carrying clearly through the broken doorframe as he dialed a number. The low, commanding tone he used was entirely professional, but there was a thread of deep, old neighborhood loyalty woven into it that made Fiona's chest ache with a sudden, overwhelming warmth. Liam, Niall said into the receiver, speaking directly to the old man. G Street is clear, but the block is compromised. We're moving Mora and Fiona to the Seaport apartment now, but I need a favor. Mrs. Higgins in 4A, she's been looking out for me since I was 9 years old. Her mind is going, and she can't be left alone on a block that Franchetti is scouting. He paused, listening to the voice on the other end, his fingers restlessly tapping against the doorframe, the same old childhood habit. No, not a facility, Niall snapped gently. She loves the harbor. Find one of our quiet residential buildings, down near South Boston Pier. Put a full-time private nurse in the apartment with her and balance the ledger under my name. I want her safe, comfortable, and I want her to have a window where she can see the ships come in from Galway. Make it happen tonight. In the dark bedroom, holding her mother's frail hand as she helped her into a warm coat, Fiona closed her eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. The radiator in apartment 4B would never clank for them again. The old velvet curtain was a thing of the past, but as she watched Niall step back through the threshold, his large frame instantly creating a shield between them and the brutal world outside. By the time they reached the towering glass structure overlooking the harbor, Mora was so exhausted from the adrenaline and her illness that she barely blinked at the sleek private elevator or the massive, cloud-like bed in the guest wing. Niall had stayed by Mora's side until a private night nurse, arranged with a single quiet phone call on the drive over, had adjusted the blankets and administered a mild sedative. Only when Mora's breathing slowed into a deep, safe rhythm did Niall finally step out of the room, shutting the door behind him with a nearly silent click. Fiona stood at the end of the long, polished hallway, holding a small duffel bag containing her mother's medications and a change of clothes. The penthouse was dead quiet, illuminated only by the ambient, silver glow of the Boston skyline cutting through the massive windows. She's asleep, Niall said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble in the shadows. He walked toward her, his posture carrying a heavy weight, though his eyes never left her face. The nurse is staying the night. She'll monitor her vitals every hour. You don't have to check the alarms tonight, Fee. You don't have to listen for her tonight. Fiona looked down at her hands, which were still trembling slightly. It's too quiet here, she whispered, the sheer exhaustion of the last 2 years and the terror of the last 2 hours finally catching up to her. My head is still ringing from the shots, Niall. He stepped closer, his large, warm hand gently taking the duffel bag from her stiff fingers and setting it on a nearby bench. He reached up, his thumb brushing a stray strand of auburn hair behind her ear. His touch was so careful, so entirely antithetical to the violence she had seen him command on G Street. Go take a shower, he murmured, his pale eyes holding hers with an intense, unyielding warmth. Your room is the first door on the left. Everything you need is in there. Let the hot water take the edge off, Fee. I'll be right here. Fiona nodded slowly, too tired to argue, too overwhelmed to maintain her armor. The master bedroom was vast, dominated by a king-sized bed draped in dark, heavy linens, but she blew right past it into the adjoining bathroom. She turned the brass fixtures of the massive walk-in shower, waiting until the room filled with a thick, suffocating cloud of white steam that smelled of eucalyptus and cedar. She stripped off her damp, soot-stained clothes and stepped under the spray. The water was scalding, a punishing heat that made her skin turn pink, but she welcomed it. She closed her eyes and let the torrent wash away the dirt of the construction sites, the sterile smell of the hospital waiting rooms, and the lingering, terrifying scent of gunpowder from the tenement hallway. For 7 years, she had been a fortress for her mother. She had been the one who didn't cry, the one who balanced the checkbook, the one who fought the city. Under the heat of the water, the stones of that fortress began to crack, one by one. When she finally stepped out of the glass enclosure, her skin was flushed and her auburn hair was damp, clinging in heavy, dark curls to her shoulders. She wrapped a thick, plush white towel tightly around her chest, tucking the edge securely above her heart, and used a smaller towel to casually dry her neck. She pushed open the heavy bathroom door, stepping back into the bedroom. Niall was there. He had taken off his unbuttoned white shirt, sitting on the edge of the mattress in nothing but his dark trousers. In the dim, amber light of the city skyline, his bare chest was a map of his survival broad, heavily muscled, but marked by a jagged pale scar near his ribs where a blade or a bullet had found him during his rise through the syndicate. He was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly as if he were fighting an internal war. When the bathroom door clicked, his head snapped up. The moment his pale green eyes landed on her, flushed from the heat, vulnerable, and stripped of all her anger, the breath left his lungs in a sharp, audible gasp. He stood up slowly, his large frame casting a long shadow across the hardwood floorboards. Fiona froze near the threshold, her fingers tightening on the knot of the towel against her chest. The silence between them was thick, vibrating with the weight of 7 years of unspent words, midnight tears, and a hunger that had been buried beneath a mountain of survival. "Niall," she whispered, her voice trembling. He closed the distance between them in 3 long, unhurried strides. He didn't say a word until he was standing directly in front of her, so close she could feel the intense, radiating heat of his skin. He smelled of the winter storm and the clean, masculine scent that was entirely his own. "I spent 7 years dreaming of this moment," Niall said, his voice dropping into a rough, fractured register that shook with a sudden, devastating honesty. "Every time I had to swallow blood, every time I had to be the monster the old man needed me to be to survive, I told myself that if I just fought hard enough, if I climbed high enough, I'd get to bring you here. I'd get to look at you without anything between us." Fiona looked up at him, her pale green eyes welling with hot, fresh tears. "You left us, Niall. I died inside." "Because I was a fool kid," he choked out, his large hands rising to cradle her face, his thumbs wiping the tears before they could track down her flushed cheeks. "Because I thought a broke street kid had nothing to offer a girl like you but danger. But tonight, when I heard your voice on that phone, when I thought those bastards were going to touch you, I realized I don't care about the syndicate. I don't care about the old man's crown. If I lose you, Fiona, there is nothing left of me but an empty life." The raw desperation in his voice shattered the very last of her reservations. Fiona let out a broken, shuddering sob and leaned her weight entirely into his chest, her hands flying up to grip his bare shoulders. At her touch, Niall's control fractured entirely. His mouth found hers in a brilliant, suffocating collision of pure need. It wasn't the terrified kiss from the bullet-holed hallway. It was a torrential downpour of years of suppressed passion. He pulled her flush against his bare chest, his large hands sliding down her back with an urgency that made her gasp into his mouth. Fiona's fingers tangled fiercely into his wavy blonde hair, pulling him deeper, her lips parting as she drank him in. She needed his strength, needed the solid, unyielding reality of him to chase away the nightmares of the tenement building. As his hands gripped her waist, lifting her slightly off her feet, the tuck of the plush towel loosened. It slipped, cascading down her skin to pool in a white ring around her ankles on the dark floorboards. Neither of them cared. Neither of them stopped. They couldn't. Niall's lips left her mouth, tracing a burning, desperate path down the column of her neck, his breath hot against her skin as a low, feral groan escaped his throat. "I love you, Fee," he growled against her pulse point, his hands sliding up to frame her back, lifting her closer until there was absolutely no space left between them. "God help me. I have loved you since I was 9 years old and starving on your bedroom floor. I never stopped. Not for a single second." Fiona arched into his touch, her hands sliding over the hard, scarred planes of his chest, her heart hammering a frantic, beautiful rhythm against his ribs. The sheer, overwhelming vulnerability of being entirely exposed to him didn't breed fear. It bred a wild, profound sense of safety. He was her shield, her monster, her boy from the closet. "I love you, Niall," she cried out softly, her voice thick with the release of 7 years of buried grief. "I hated you for staying away, but I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped loving you." He lifted her fully then, her legs instinctively wrapping around his waist as he carried her the few short steps to the massive bed. They tumbled onto the dark linens together, a chaotic tangle of limbs, damp auburn hair, and whispered declarations of a love that had survived the very worst of the city streets. In the quiet silver light of the seaport, the fortress she had built to survive was entirely gone, replaced by the absolute sanctuary of his arms. 3 weeks had passed since the night G Street fractured. Maura was sleeping in the guest wing A, massive sunlit room that looked out over the water. Niall had bypassed the city's standard medical waitlists, bringing a private oncologist directly to the penthouse 3 times a week. Under the specialized care, a faint, resilient glow had finally begun to return to her mother's face. Fiona stood by the glass, a mug of hot tea cradled between her hands. She wore a soft, oversized sweater, her dark auburn hair falling loose, over her shoulders. She had kept her job at Callahan Construction. Niall had tried to buy the company on Tuesday, but she had threatened to walk right back to G Street if he interfered with her career. He had backed down, showcasing the one thing the entire Boston underworld knew to be true. The old man's ruthless shadow could be brought to a complete halt by a single look from Fiona Murphy. A pair of strong, familiar arms slid around her waist from behind. Niall pulled her back against his chest, his chin resting gently in the crook of her neck. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, smelling of clean cedar, cold winter air, and the faint, sweet scent of the peppermint tea she had made. "You're awake late," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly resonance against her skin. "Just thinking," Fiona murmured, leaning back into his strength. She didn't feel out of place in the luxury anymore. The space didn't matter. The man holding her did. "I talked to Mrs. Higgins today, on the phone." Niall's grip around her waist tightened just a fraction, a soft smile catching the corner of his sharp jawline. "How is she?" "She loves the new apartment," Fiona said, turning slightly in his arms so she could look up into his pale green eyes. "She told me she can see the big container ships coming in from Europe right from her kitchen table. She's convinced the captain of the morning vessel is her cousin from County Clare. The nurse you hired just makes her fresh scones and lets her talk." Niall let out a low, breathy laugh, the tension completely draining from his broad shoulders. Good. She earned a view of the water. Fiona set her tea down on the marble console and reached up, her fingers gently tracing the thin, pale scar that sliced through his left eyebrow, the permanent reminder of the night he had stood between her and the monsters of their youth. "You gave her a sanctuary, Niall," she whispered, her green eyes shining with a deep, fierce emotion that years of separation hadn't diminished. "You gave my mother a fighting chance, and you gave me—" "What did I give you, Fee?" he asked, his voice dropping into a raw, desperate sincerity, his thumbs tracing the line of her hip bones. "A place to stop fighting," she said softly. Niall went entirely still, the brilliant, lethal prince of the city melting away to reveal the 11-year-old boy who had found his entire universe behind a blue velvet curtain. He reached out, his hand tangling into her auburn hair, and pulled her into a kiss that felt like the end of a long, exhausting voyage. It was deep, unhurried, and anchored in a love that had survived hunger, grief, and the dark evolution of the streets. Outside, a light flurry of December snow began to fall, the white flakes dancing against the glass before vanishing into the dark harbor below. Niall broke the kiss just enough to look down at her, his hands holding her face as if she were the only real thing in a city built on smoke and mirrors. "I'm never letting go, Fee," he promised against her lips. "The closet door stays open." Fiona smiled, her arms wrapping securely around his neck as she pulled him back down to her. 2 inches, she whispered into the quiet dark, always.